This is Beyond the Weekend, a podcast of Cornerstone Church, where we dig into the things we didn't have time for on Sunday. Welcome to BTW. Welcome to this week's episode of Beyond the Weekend. I'm Mandy Fowler, Director of Spiritual Formation for Cornerstone, and today I'm being joined by Betsy Marvin, who's our Senior Director of Discipleship. Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you, Mandy. Good to be here.
You team taught the message yesterday at 84th Street, this message that you wrote on Joseph and God as the refiner as our characteristic for this week, which let's briefly talk about just a little bit of why that was meaningful on Confirmation Sunday, because that's something, that was a cool, that it worked out, that it was Confirmation Sunday.
Yeah, I think when we are in a season of eighth grader, right, we have such a limited view of the whole. And so just to remember that we are going to walk through spiritual journey seasons, and high school for them is going to be a next one. And all of these things that in their middle school years, if they can have a foundation of what they know and believe, then that's only going to grow going forward. And just like Joseph, he had to grow and go forward. He knew God. He was raised to know God by his father Jacob, but he didn't truly have the character that he needed. And not that God caused anything bad to happen. There were some other consequences there, but God used his circumstances to help him grow. And I really felt like, as you look at these 12, 13-year-olds, God is going to use circumstances in your life to grow. He's not the cause of bad things, but he can use them to grow you, and kind of know that before they even come, hoping that. So just kind of a way to parallel our 17-year-old Joseph with our 13, 14-year-old confirmation kids, and knowing that we're all on a journey.
Well, and I think it's such a great tie-in, too, because Joseph obviously had some plans for his life.
Yes, he did.
And then things really did not go according to plan, as they so often don't.
Exactly.
In our lives. And so how do we develop kind of some resiliency there, some faith in the God who will continue to be with us no matter what is happening, and to try and, allow God to work in us during those unexpected circumstances.
He's going to refine us, because ultimately he's trying to help us become more like his son. And so in moments where we know maybe we're not the best we can be, he wants to use that to refine us to become more like him.
Yeah. Let's touch a little bit on, because gosh, there's so many chapters to this story, and so it is very hard to kind of drop ourselves into the one place in the story, or a couple places in the story. But so let's talk a little bit, because the story that we started with was about Joseph and his dreams and his relationship with all of his brothers. So let's talk a little bit about the backstory there of what's going on with this big, large family of brothers. And
oh man, it is so, I guess, weird would be the word to think of. Jacob has two wives, and then two of their maids become basically wives, and they all have children, and it's just nuts. And the competition between the mothers and all of that. But honestly, as you look at Jacob, it's like he didn't really learn from the favoritism issues, right?
Right,
so,
that we just talked about last week with Esau, he and Esau,
It's like way back to Abel, there was a feeling of favoritism, and then you get to Isaac and Ishmael, and then Jacob and Esau. It's like, although it's not meant from God to have any of that, as humans, we definitely tend toward favoritism
and hierarchy.
Hierarchy. So Joseph, being the son of the favorite wife, the one that Jacob worked the longest to actually have as a wife, who he loved dearly from almost the moment he saw her, right? So you have all of that history, and then Rachel dies giving birth to her second son, Benjamin. And so basically Joseph is raised by Leah and the other women. So when he says he sees his mother in the dream, it's Leah, because that's who he knows. But I think that favoritism line, and then you create all this rivalry. Can you imagine 11 brothers, and they're all just a few years apart? just all the teenagers at once.
So
It'd be so crazy.
the house would stink too.
Oh, yes, it would stink. And I know there's a daughter or two in there, but
Sure.
just the rivalry and the competition, and they all had to work in the family business. And then Dad was wealthy, so they kind of had everything they needed, but he still made them work. And the dynamics of that.
And here
would have
comes
been
Joseph
nuts.
saying, guess what I dreamed?
Yeah, as he's wearing the colorful coat that says, I'm going to get a double portion of all you're working for.
Right.
And so, because you get the impression that he wore it a lot.
Yeah, sure.
Because he
you
was
would. I mean,
proud of it.
yeah. And then, the lack of self-awareness maybe to tell your brothers, even if you had that dream, just,
Yeah. Yeah, like, just tell your dad.
Yeah,
It's okay.
yeah.
Just tell your mom.
just journal about it.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. Yes.
Oh, man.
But yeah. And the age range, right? So by the time Joseph is 17, Reuben, who's the oldest, was got to be almost 40. And so for this 17-year-old punk in his really great coat to walk out to you and basically say, you're going to bow to me
Oh, my gosh.
at 40 or 39 or 38,
Yeah.
it would have been like, seriously, kid,
Yeah, that would be.
you are not.
I'm the oldest of in my family, so I resonate with it.
Yes.
That's a challenge. Yeah, it's a challenging dynamic. Well, and that's true in even the closest of families, the healthiest of families. But in this case, this is kind of exhibit A for why polygamy is not the best.
Not good.
Not the best setup. Because there's going to be a favorite wife. There's going to be a favorite. It's just
Well, then you think of how much Rebecca played into the favoritism in her sons. So how much did Leah play into that?
Right.
Like as Reuben's mom being able to know she wasn't necessarily wanted at first, but became loved later. Like what bitterness did that instill in him? And all those things.
Well, and if you've got a house full of a few women that are mothering children, they're all going to want their own kids to be that's just so it is kind of a recipe for disaster, and that is why one of the many reasons that we believe in monogamy.
Yes.
But this is this is the culture at the time, so
it is. And then you think, even in all that mess, they become the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right.
So God still uses them, even though, especially for Reuben, he really messes up. And it's just, God still has a tribe of Reuben. He doesn't dismiss him because of his sin.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Which is God's pattern throughout the Old Testament. Okay, yeah, so that's so interesting. And there is, this continued repeat theme of brothers and jealousy and favoritism. So it's just interesting to notice. And I feel like a reason that still resonates with people today is because that's, the sibling relationship can be really hard.
Yes, it can. Sibling rivalry is real.
Yes, it is. It is. And so that's just one more example of, despite being thousands of years old, we can still connect to these stories. Let's talk about, you did mention that one thing that you had to cut from the sermon was kind of the connections, maybe the foreshadowing of Joseph and Jesus. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, in my study of Joseph, it was interesting to hear from so many different commentaries that the Israelites were looking for someone like Joseph to be Messiah. Joseph-David combination, that someone who would be high up in the current government, someone who would rule and have a voice to the Pharaoh, voice to the Roman king, somebody like that. So they looked back to Joseph, and if you put the stories side by side, from the beginning, they had brothers who didn't understand them. They were both envied by their brothers. They were both sold for silver. Interestingly enough, 30 pieces for Jesus, 20 pieces for Joseph. Interesting in that. And betrayed by a brother. And for Jesus, a brotherhood kind of brother in that way. They both grew in quiet. Joseph under Potiphar and Jesus in his home until they were 30. And they both entered their ministry phase, so to speak, at 30 years old. Both of their stories have an underlying deep element of forgiveness Joseph for his brothers, Jesus for all of us.
All of mankind, yeah.
And for Joseph, a part of the story we didn't talk about is how his position in the Egyptian government allowed him to bring his entire family into an area of Egypt where they were protected. And for a while, that was wonderful until there were so many of them, they became slaves.
Right.
And how he saved an entire nation of people that will become Israel, and how Jesus saves all of us, an entire world. And it all is through forgiveness and protection. And so often Joseph is looked at as savior in the Israelite culture because he saved them from the famine and saved them all to go forward. But then Jesus, of course, savior of the world. So it's just this parallel of the characteristics of Jesus we see in Joseph were God's refining in him, and him becoming who he needed to be to do God's work, which is what God does in us. So just that parallel of all of those things, especially the 30 years old part, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
Like both were 30, both had to deal with sibling rivalry elements, both had mothers that played a significant role in their lives, like just over and over. There's so many things.
Fascinating. That's really interesting. Well, let's talk. Yeah, let's dig in a little bit more about this idea of God as refiner. Does it mean that God, I mean, we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but I think sometimes people, the way that they understand this is that God causes these bad or tough or awful things in my life to teach me a lesson. And sometimes I hear people kind of talk that way. So even though we touched on it in the sermon as well, let's dig into that and unpack why that's not true.
Because isn't that always our first question? Kind of in the message yesterday, Tom said, why are you letting this happen? And it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, why he doesn't step in and just force his choices on us, right? So we live in a world where we are going to be affected by people who sin. We live in a world that has accidents and cancer and all of these things, and it's nobody's fault sometimes, but they happen, or they're consequences because of our own poor choices or character. So in Joseph's case, poor choices and character are a piece of the consequences, but also brothers who are filled with jealousy and envy and hatred, it says. And because they hated him due to all the family dynamics and all the backstory, Joseph pays a price for that. And God could have stopped it, sure. I mean, he's God.
Yeah.
But he doesn't step in and do that. He allows our choices to be played out. So Joseph's choice of being prideful and arrogant, the brothers' choice of hatred, come together to be sold into slavery. Thankfully, not death. But so often in our lives, so many things that happen to us are the cause of our own consequences of poor character or consequences of someone else's character affecting our life, right? Like divorce. So then the wonder is when God says he works all things for good, is that God can take that circumstance and work in it toward his good. And it seems like, well, then why didn't he just not let that not happen? But he chose that all the way from the very beginning. We get to choose the tree of independence or the tree of surrender in walking with Jesus. And each time that conflict, that confrontation, that wall pushes us forward. So he uses it, but he doesn't cause it. And I think in our humanity, that's so hard to understand.
It is, but it keeps going back to sometimes the way that I'll phrase it is like, God does everything he can to preserve our free will. And that means, unfortunately, I mean, it means that he can't constantly intervene in people's free will because then they don't have free will.
Yeah, exactly.
So he can't, constantly step in because that messes up the whole premise, like the whole setup. If he's constantly intervening in people's bad choices, even I think that's to his great pain because it means he can't just constantly, imagine if he was just constantly stopping every bad thing from happening, it would no longer be free choice. And so unfortunately, like that means he has to like allow things to happen, I think, to his great pain, like he doesn't enjoy seeing people suffer, and he hates that, the amount of suffering that sin causes his children. And so, but out of love, he is, going to try and bring goodness out of terrible situations. And so,
and he is always with us.
Right.
So even though we might make a poor choice, he's still with us. He's just not going to stop us.
Right.
He's going to allow us to make that choice, because in it, hopefully, we will learn.
Yeah.
And become more like him on the other side.
Yeah. And to spiritually mature and emotionally mature and, all of these things that don't happen otherwise. If we're constantly, and that's, I'm not a parent, but I've been around enough kids to know, like, when your kid is, you reach a point where, like, you could try and stop your kid from making every bad decision.
Yes.
However, that doesn't produce somebody who's able to make good decisions.
You have to let them pay the consequences.
Right. So, just so that, then they learn in that next time, so.
And then they have to choose whether they're going to learn or not.
Yeah.
Right. Which is also the refining element. We have to choose if we're going to allow God to refine us and teach us something, or if we're just going to step away and go, forget it.
Right. Oh yeah. That was another element that, we brought in the image of the spiritual journey and describing, some of these situations or circumstances in our lives as the wall, that where we might hit suddenly, something big that makes us question God or, what's going, this is so far off my plan that I don't even, is God good? For some people, they might run into that. And we do kind of have like a crossroads there in terms of, will I trust that God is with me, or will I kind of just walk away?
Yeah.
Which is really tough. Like, that's a really tough, that's something we can all relate to, something we all experience, if not definitely at least once, but most of us many, many times. And the more that we experience God in those tough challenges, I think the more we have to like trust, that's one benefit of getting older. So we have more life to look back on.
We have more hindsight.
Yeah. And be like, well, he was with me last time,
Well, and I think we live in a culture that likes to blame people. It has to be somebody's fault. And then when it comes to something we can't explain, then it's God's fault. And then that shifts how we walk with him in it, because when you blame someone, you often don't want to be with them. So by shifting our mindset to realize this isn't God's fault, but he's with you in it and will help you get through it, will help you stay connected to God in the process, versus put up a wall between you and him because you're blaming versus seeing where God can be in it. And it's a hard mindset. That's a maturity mindset.
Yeah.
And then also realizing there are some things that are nobody's fault.
Right.
They are just, our sinful world has, diseases and crime and things that happen.
Yeah. Well, and I also just want to make sure that people are hearing us in this, like, this isn't a way of minizing terrible circumstances in your life. We don't want you to be like, well, I guess I just have to tough it out and learn this, like God is with us in such a deep way, and it's not, it's always to bring goodness out of what was terrible, it's not, point. So I just want to make sure people are, cause, there's some really, I have some people in my life where I'm like, my goodness, I cannot believe how difficult their life has been, and I never want somebody to think like, well, I must have a lot to learn,
Exactly.
So that don't mishear us in this, like, it's just that God's goodness and promised presence will always be with us.
Yeah.
No matter what the circumstances of the world bring and the circumstances of family members who've sent, in Joseph's case, like going back to his grandfather, like stuff that's in his family that he has absolutely no control over. Stuff that's done to him when he's accused of a crime he didn't commit and thrown into prison. Oh, there's another comparison to Jesus.
Yes.
Innocent man.
Yeah. Innocent man.
Unjustly found guilty of a crime. Yeah. Anyway.
And one thing that comes to mind, I think, too, as you say that, to be so clear. Like if you're in an abusive situation, you don't just say, well, God is with me and he's going to teach me in this. Like there are situations where God is with you, but he's not making you stay there. Yeah. Or if something happens to you that's horrible, God is with you, but he also wants to help move you into something of healing, which may seem like in the moment not even possible. Right. But those things are so different than what we're talking about here with the wall, which is an inner character issue or a situation in your life that makes you really question who God is or your own identity. Like those are the walls that that Joseph was facing. That's great,
because sometimes there can be sort of, well, I guess I just have to suffer through this because it's going to do something in me. It's
God will make it good.
That's not what we're saying. So we have to put some caveats around this. But I hope you're hearing the heart of this. Yeah. And God is refiner. Great. Well, this was week 8 of our series. We just have one more week left.
Ooh, it's gone fast.
Story. It really has. We always say that. But
the study has been deep and hard and wonderful. So I'm going to miss that part of this teaching series. But I know what's coming is also good.
Yeah. So hope you won't miss week 9 of the series, and then we'll be moving into our Lent series. So lots of good stuff ahead for the year. But thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.